fact, that is good of this kind of programs that policymakers get to see another side of this sector and maybe understand, because she's talking about few countries create their own internet.
Well, there, that's sort of a position that, for example, Russia is pushing in China. They're basically saying, oh, the internet was originated by the US, and so the US controls all of this. Actually, no, the US doesn't control most of it. It is controlled by corporate companies now
Exactly.
that decide what standards they want to and don't want to apply. It just happens that most of those companies are in the US. But then the other point of it is they have invested a lot of money into it over the past decades. It's the same thing. I mean, if you're going to say, I need a car, well, you're going to buy a car from a company that manufactures the car.
Exactly.
That is the company that's going to listen to its consumer base to decide what features it wants in the car. You want a car with 5 wheels? Go build your own company and build it. Nobody's stopping you.
That's
But
completely.
saying, why don't you build a 5-wheel car? Because I don't want to.
Exactly. I totally agree with that.
I mean, and this whole thing, like countries around the, okay, look at Milnet, in the US, or you look at all of the military networks. They are run independently. Why? Because they're not connected to anything. They can have any naming conventions they want. They can do whatever they want. But it's when you want to talk to the rest of the world, that's when the problem rises.
Yes. Exactly. But that's her personality. She's always in all the meetings. She's pushing, questioning. That's not bad.
It's okay. Gives you diversity of thought.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome all at the Internet Society briefing panel. The Internet Society briefing panels are a way for the Internet Society to inform itself about things that are of its interest and inform its community about things that are of its interest. We organize them when we think we have a topic of interest here at the IETF. But this is not an IETF session. When you stepped into this room, you stepped out of the IETF, so the note well doesn't apply and so on and so forth. I think that's important to know. We're not doing protocol engineering work here. So the Internet Society works on the intersection between technology, policy, and development of human capacities. And one of the things that the Internet Society has done for a long stretch now is introduce policy people, regulators, people that work in ministries to the IETF through a program in which we invite those policymakers to the IETF to expose them to the workings, to create a better understanding of how the cake is made, how the dish is prepared. Since the internet has such an impact on our public lives, our economic prosperity, our social interaction, obviously the internet as a whole has become the interest of public policy. There's a responsibility of policymakers to interact and understand the internet and understand what impact that has on the lives of the citizens that they represent. So public policymakers have also come to the IETF and asked them questions like, what can you do with respect to this transition of the classic old telephone system to voice over IP systems, and that led to working groups like ECRIT. and PAWS. So what we thought we would do is have a little bit of a discussion about the interaction between public policy people and the IETF in the context of a wider audience than just a set of people that are involved in the public policy program. And try to understand how that interaction works, what the mutual expectations are. So we've set up a panel with a number of policymakers that are from the region. I'll let them introduce them to you shortly. And with people with a background in the IETF, and we even have somebody who has 2 backgrounds in this sense. The rules of engagement here are that these people come with their background, but they speak on personal title. They come with experience, they come with an informed position, but just as in the IETF, they speak on personal title, so it should not be mistaken that they represent necessarily the view of their government or their company. And with that, I would like to ask the panelists, starting with Dilawar here, to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dilawar Grewal. I'm a vice president at the University of South Pacific, which runs one of the largest networks in the South Pacific. And my other role is in advisory capacity to the governments of the region, which have a loosely knit network of how they deal with security, network development, and IT issues in the region. So it's called CROP, which is Council of Regional Organizations of the Pacific, includes the governments, the donors, and also the private sector. So we lead the IT working group in that region. Thank you.
Thank you. Nelson, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nelson Guillen. I come from the Dominican Institute of Telecommunications. Indotel, it's the regulator in the Dominican Republic. I've been there for 13 years now. I now work at the Directive Council. We mostly make every decision, administrative and regulatory. But I have a technical background. I'm a telecom engineer. So that's pretty much it.
Raul?
Hello, everyone. Well, my name is Raúl Lascano. I'm electrical engineer. I'm working in the Chilean regulator. The name is Subtel. Subtel is in charge of the regulator process for all the services, telecommunication services in Chile, including broadcasting services, radio and television, mobile services, fixed services, data services, and inside the data services, including internet. So I'm working in Subtel by 14 years, and now we are in charge of the regulation of all these services that I said you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Tim Polk. I actually work at the U.S. Office of Science and Technology Policy. I have for the last 3 years. At OSTP, we do policy for science and science for policy. For the policy for science is advising on what kind of policies will support the development of science and technology areas. And then in the second role that we do when we say policy for science, it's science for policy. It's trying to make sure that the policies and regulations that people offer or propose are founded on good science rather than the idea that the Earth is flat. And so that sort of is our twin roles. Before I spent time at Office of Science and Technology Policy, I spent the previous 15 years mainly working here in the IETF for the US Department of Commerce, working on security areas.
Hi, I'm Fred Baker. I work for a small company named Cisco Systems. You may have heard of us. And when I'm not working on IETF things or writing white papers for Cisco and writing specifications within Cisco, one of the things that I do is represent Cisco in the Broadband Internet Technology Advisory Group, which is a group of companies that write educational material for regulators in dealing with policy questions.
Thank you. So, broad panel, I would say, with various backgrounds, some in engineering, some in the ITF. I'm happy that you're all here. I want to just do a small raise of hands, because I know that there are a number of people with a policy background in this room. And there are quite a few numbers, of course, that do strict engineering work. So the people who consider themselves engineers, can you raise your hands just for a small field? Okay, thank you. The people who consider themselves policymakers, can you raise your hands? That's a smaller group, but still a significant amount of people that are here that have an interest in the IETF. Now, a third question, who considers themselves to be in a bridging function or takes up that bridging function? That's also quite a set of hands that I see raised. So this is the space that we're going to explore. What are our mutual roles vis-à-vis policy, engineering, and the IETF? And basically, to start that conversation, for the people with the regulatory background, what is the public policy issues? What are the public policy issues that keep you awake at night and bring you to the IETF? And then for the people with the background in IETF work, why are you looking at policymakers for your work? And Tim, you got to answer both of these questions. Let me start with Nelson. Yeah, it's easier to stand up so that everybody knows who's speaking.
Well, as policymakers, we have a wide variety of functions. Mainly, we basically want to use technology to make people's life better. That's our main job. And also, we have specific subjects that makes the IETF of interest for us, besides the fundamental and significant work you do to make a better and open and stable internet. We have specific subjects that keep us awake at night, as Olaf said. For example, in our country, as I said, I come from Dominican Republic, we are working very hard on our cybersecurity strategy. We've been putting a lot of effort in all the cybersecurity issues and trying to create our first cert. We also are putting a lot of work in making the internet better for the people in sense of the user experience. That means the quality of service. We have updated lately our quality regulation, but we only did it in the telephone service size because we still don't feel like we have all the tools to to know what to measure and how to measure it in terms of the internet service. That is another issue that it's very significant for us, because we have to rely in the reports of the quality levels that the companies send to us. And we don't have our own reports to compare with the company levels. So in the end, we do not have the certain information to defend the user rights to receive the quality level that they have contracted with the company. So internet service measurements and how to measure, what's the best tool and everything. And another issue that I know it is not in the field of action of the IETF, but I think it's worth to mention, is the child abuse on the internet. We've been having a lot of cases of child abuse on the net, and we are also working in that issue.
Thank you. Delaware?
I ride many boats or horses, whatever you want to call it. So the regulators come sort of in between the infrastructure and the end user experience. Whether you look at cell phone penetration or you look at accessibility of broadband to end users or economic development, which the politicians and the governments are usually interested in, on one end, you have the end product. What is being made available to the end user and how are they getting it? The regulators use that basically to say, okay, what regulations should be in place, what policy should be in place to maximize it. IETF, as I see, the role is to provide the base technology development. Where is this thing going in the next few years, few decades, centuries? In the middle of all of this is a translation from a truly technical side of things to a policy-driven, regulation-driven market environment that in the end will provide a user experience. I'm an engineer. Most engineers in the room do not actually, at the risk of getting beaten up, don't actually think how policymakers would interpret the technology that they are putting forward. I'll give you an example. You can bring submarine cable to an island nation, and you can have the regulators in place to provide an open market environment. And then you can have government or private sector initiatives to provide use to the end users. Somewhere in between, the very first step is forgotten. Whose electronics and optics gets put at the landing station, and how is that controlled? It is the technology people will say, well, we have the technology, do whatever you want to do. The regulators will say, well, not my problem, we haven't gotten it yet. The end users say, I don't even know about it. So a direction from a policy perspective to the technology makers and from the technology makers to the policy makers would be one of those things that would actually change our environment quite dramatically in the future. And that is the kind of bridge I think we should try and build between what IETF does and what policymakers do. Because right now there's no connection. I'll give an example of Fiji. We have broadband, we have gigabit connections coming, Southern Cross brings fiber to the country. The landing station is controlled by Fintel, and it charges the traffic in and out of the country for a 20 centimeter cable by the megabit. Now the regulators don't touch it because it's not about markets within the country. The technology people don't touch it because that's not their problem. And yet, think about the end user experience, whether it's a university with a research network or whether it is commercial trying to set up a call center. Everything has to go through this pipeline, a bottleneck. where you have to pay through the nose. Whose problem is it? I'm hoping it is everybody's. So that is the kind of conversation I would like to see have more impact and originate both from an IETF and a policy standpoint in forums like these.
Thank you. Raul, please.
Well, answering the question of Olaf, the first question is, what is our main issue today in Chile? Well, the main issue, I think, is internet. Internet is the big issue today for us in the terms of the regulation that we have to deploy. And for these different reasons, we have some problems to reach the goal for regulate well this service. And we think that the internet is the most important service that we have in the actually. And the second question was why I'm here. As you see, it's the first time I'm a new attendant. And that's because in the case of Chile regulation, we are, from the historically perspective, we are far away from the IETF work. When we develop rules, we always make a benchmark of different international institutions looking for a technical reference to make rules. In the different services that we are involved, one of these services is internet today, but others are mobile and fixed networks and broadcasting. And we look always in ITU, for example, IEEE, ETSI are our reference. But of course, IETF is our reference too. But for different reasons, IETF is far away from others. This reason, I can say this, the IETF rules are deeply technical. And maybe we have a lack with technical professional that can analyze in deep these rules. And of course, the question for the community is, how can you help us to be more near of IETF, to analyze, to participate more in this development, you know? Because, how I said before, internet is a more important service for us today. And IETF, of course, is one of the more important community to develop rules in internet, you know? So this is my question for you. How can you help us? Considering our lack of technical professionals, we always have a lack of budget, etc.
Thank you. Tim, yeah, logical progression.
So my role in policy is a little different because I'm not a regulator. I'm interested in the R&D funding, the workforce development, the infrastructure that needs to be in place to support a technology area. And cybersecurity for the internet is one of those areas that I work in. From that point of view, I think our basic policy driver is that we see the internet as an extremely important platform for promoting innovation, for economic competitiveness, and for and for the free exchange of ideas. So that is a core thing, is that the internet is a good thing and we want to see it grow, and we want to see it grow not only in the US but elsewhere. However, we also see that cybersecurity issues are a threat to the benefits that we believe the internet has to offer. If we are not able to protect people who are using the internet for those, to transact business, to share ideas, to do new innovations, then that becomes a loss to all of us. And so that is really a core piece. Within that, as a policy space, we recognize that we don't have a corner on all of the good ideas that are out there. And so that's one of the reasons that we favor multi-stakeholder organizations, particularly for standards development, and that's why we have been long so involved in the IETF. So we believe that US companies and others will do better if the cybersecurity standards that they are using are internationally accepted, so that we can use the same techniques in different countries. So that's one piece of the policy things, and we look to the IETF to continue to be the kind of organization where businesses, governments, civil society, and yes, policy people can come in, share the ideas, and end up with the best standards possible. From a technologist's point of view, in my years in the IETF, is I always see the IETF's responsibility as delivering the best technical standards to support the broadest range of policy options. Not all policies in all countries are going to be the same. We certainly have, we would support the, we want to reduce the cost and provide greater access, but we recognize that those things are going to be applied differently in different places. We, when I wear my IETF technologist hat, we need to provide those kinds of options. The last thing I'll say at this point is, as a guy who used to be a tech guy, now is a policy guy, and probably in about a year will be a tech guy again, the big challenge that I really see here is for us to find ways to develop cybersecurity standards that will be almost self-motivated to be implemented. One of the great things, quick aside, I will give up the mic in a second, people are always saying, well, do we need a new internet? Do Internet 2.0? And I always tell them, the new internet is being developed every day. It's evolving all of the time. And the internet has shown a terrific capacity to evolve, to handle capacity issues, addressing issues. You know, we should have run out of addresses a long time ago. The problem is that somehow we have not been able to make those same pieces happen with cybersecurity. We have the standards that are out there that if we know that if everyone implemented them, the internet would be a better place. The challenge that I see in my policy role is figuring out how to motivate adoption and deployment of those. Some pieces we're going to be able to do as policymakers. Some pieces we're going to need help from the tech community. And so I'll stop at that point.
So, okay. My interest and involvement in the intersection of technology and policy is really a question of difference of expertise. Certainly I've heard of the internet and helped develop some of the technologies that are in it. I understand them pretty well. When I go talk with FCC or with various governments or whatever, I'm not talking with people that are not expert. I'm talking with people that don't have my expertise. They have different expertise. So at the FCC, often I'm talking with economists, and they're asking me questions that frankly I have no idea what the answer is. What is going to be the economic impact of this change? I don't know. I'm not an economist. but I can talk with them about the technology, and we can have that kind of discussion. What's most interesting to me then is the goals that they might be setting and what their objectives might be, and then what education that I can give them. I found myself at a RANDS conference in 2004, which is a conference between the government of Russia and the service providers of that country, where they discuss the regulations that they're just about to enact. And I found myself on a panel that was being run by the Colonel General who ran Department K, which is cybersecurity. He's trying very hard to figure out why I was there and what question I was being asked. And all they would tell me was that it was about security. Turned out that his fundamental question was, how do I control the internet like the Chinese and the Israeli do? It was literally the question he was asking. And well, my first question then was, do they actually control? I'm not sure they do. But you know, so we were talking about something very specific to his world, and the goals that he had, that frankly I don't share, and where, you know, what is the direction that I would send him, and you know, how might that go? I found myself at one point talking with the UN allocated task force, who asked me, you know, could you please just kind of look at the bits that are going by on the wire, identify the content is being promulgated by Al-Qaeda, and make it go away. How well have we done with pornography? You know, I'm not sure I'm even capable of doing that. And so talking with them about what can be done, what can't be done, what might work, what might not work, and their goals. So oftentimes when I'm talking with policy regulators, I'm dealing with misconceptions and baggage, and trying to help them to understand the world in which they're being propelled, so that they can make better regulatory decisions. And that I see as a large part of my activity there.
Clear. Thank you. So, yeah, I heard a couple of things. And that bridging function is important. This is where technology bridges between, regulators bridge between the end user and the technology. I would pose that there is also that direct interaction. I think that when we look at this room, we're all users of the internet ourselves, and we bring that perspective. But I also heard something about a broad set of options to be able to play with. And that resonates with something that I've read a long time ago in a paper by Dave Clark and his colleagues in SIGCOMM 2002, I believe, the tussle in cyberspace, which basically says, you know, if you design architecture and protocol, make sure that you design for an economic and a policy tussle so that that can play out in the market. That is a very was a technical architectural paper, but I think I've heard you talk about that. Could you comment on that?
I think philosophically that's a very important point to take into consideration. I was once asked by a minister, saying, why do you guys oppose so much building backdoors into systems that we can use? I said, we don't. You do. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, if we build a backdoor for you, what's it stopping somebody else from using the same backdoor? I'm sure you don't want that, he said. And his reply was, oh. And that was the end of the conversation. What that brings me to is that when you design protocols, when you design technology, the more it is based upon interoperability and open standards, better it is for the market situations to govern itself and drive it in a way which benefits more and more people. More restrictive things that are designed for a particular end user, say a government or a backdoor into building backdoors into things, the more restrictive they are, less opportunity we take from the environment to govern basically where that product will end up. which means the control will end up with fewer and fewer hands, which is very contrary to what the internet is about, which is bringing knowledge, economic welfare to all, not just to some. So I think when technical people focus a little bit more on interoperability and open standards, they actually open up a whole lot of doors for regulators, for policymakers, for user advocates to come in and maintain that openness and provide more opportunity than the other way around.
Is there somebody else in the panel who would like to respond to that? Somebody else who would like to respond to that?
I will add one thing to that. I think that was a great summary of what we need to be doing, but I think that there's one other piece beyond, by doing open standards, you provide the platform for innovation as well at other layers. And if we do standards well in the IETF, we've shown that that kind of innovation happens. If standards are done poorly, they can become an inhibiting factor. And I think that that's a very important second piece, is to make sure that we are not the inhibiting factor.
So we already talked a little bit about the intersection of policy work and the IETF work. You talked about cybersecurity. You talked about quality of service. Nelson or Raul? Nelson. Raul, you talked about quality of service. Is that a conversation that you find you can have in the IETF, or do you find the work on the building blocks too challenging to have that interaction? There's a relatively open question. The IETF works on very fundamental building blocks here, and if you go to the working groups, often it's about, you know, the bits and the bytes and the details and things here. Do you have the feeling that you have the opportunity to bring your requirements to the IETF at a useful time? So a fairly open question, I think.
Well, I think yes, and I think this might relate with all we've been talking about openness and the interaction between technology and policymaking, because I think in the end, the technical side and the policy side wants a better internet, and an internet that works for the best for all human beings. So I think it is good that policy makers get to know all these philosophy behind the creation of the protocols and the technology that supports the internet. I think it is good for us to know that this openness and this transparency and all this way that you use to create everything, this consensus, all this, it is good for us to know that it is in the DNA of the technology, and that we sometimes might come to you to ask, hey, how can I put this regulation in to work in order to respect and maintain the creation principles of the technology. It is good if we get to know that and see all this process of creation that the IETF uses, and that might help us to respect all that and make better regulations to achieve our objectives. I think that relates with what Dilawar was saying about how you should keep everything open for the better use. So we should also regulate, but regulate trying to keep things as open as possible, and in order to let people keep developing and designing and opening new opportunities to use the technology. So I think it's not only possible, I think this is one of the best places to come and ask and have open conversations, because in the end I think we have more in common than differences. So I think it's not only one place, but it's one of the best places to come and ask questions and have conversations.
Thank you.
So I want to key on one word that you used, which was regulate. In English, we use that word quite often to prevent something from happening, to make it always be the same, to remove bumps from the road, that kind of thing. If I think of a voltage regulator, what it does is it makes sure that the voltage is always the same. And one of the worries that communities like ours have about regulation is that maybe we want to change it. And, would the regulation be in the way? One of the things that I've been involved with, that we've tried to impress regulators with, is that the important thing is to support and enable innovation and growth, and the growth of a country's gross domestic product as a result of the regulation. And what you want to prevent, if anything, is bad things like spam, attacks of various kinds, and make the wrong things not happen. I think if this community has any concern about regulations and regulators, that would probably summarize it. Please help us do our job and don't be in the way.
If I could add to that, I think that there's also a piece, and I completely agree with all of that, there's a piece that this community can do to work with the policymakers and educate them on what the art of the possible is and is not. Because often regulators have a completely different idea of what the internet is, how it works, and they would like to fit it into a very square box that really isn't there. It's not because they aren't well-intentioned, it's because they don't understand how it all works. And so there is a responsibility, they have a responsibility to get educated and make sure that they're developing regulations that actually do reflect the real state of the earth, that the world is not flat. But speaking with my IETF hat again on for a second, we have a responsibility to help those policymakers by understanding what can and can't be done, and then they can work within that framework for what is best in their country.
Raul?
Yes, answering your question, Bluff, and follow the words of my colleague Nelson, I think that it's very necessary, the interaction between policymakers and the community of IETF. Very necessary, because we need the advisory of technical issues. But today I can see a gap between these technical issues that are very deeply technical and the way that we construct or develop the rules. Well, so it's very important that IETF include the policymakers in this work. It's very important. When we develop rules, always we have a political problem to solve, and technical problem. The rules contains political issues that are not technical. And of course, technical issues. Always I have to fight with the political issues more than the technical issues. Yeah. So, because the political has another goals, different. But if I have the advisory of a good technical community, I can do rules in the correct way. So these kind of meetings for me are very important, you know.
So, do you want to speak to it, Delaware? Or not yet? So I hear something here that I think is important. If I may summarize this in my own words, I've heard at least two of you speak about the enabling environment of the internet, and to me that's a sort of shared goal that I've heard that we share collectively, and understanding that technologists and regulators can be allies in making the internet better is, I think, an important step in order to talk among each other. But I heard something different as well. Earlier, you were talking about the FCC setup, Fred, and Raul, you were talking just a minute ago, like, I'd like to have access to the knowledge, to the technical knowledge. Being somewhat of an engineer myself, I always think about scalability issues and centralization. And my question would be, do you have access to specialists with this background in internet technology in your local area that you can knock on the door and say, can you help me? I know that in some places there is, for instance, a very active ISOC chapter with good technologists. Some other places there are no ISOC chapters at all, and you don't necessarily need ISOC to get that interaction going, of course. There are other places to go for technologists as well. How do we get that interaction going on, say, a local level, instead of having to have this interaction all the time at the global level, namely in the IETF or in other technical fora? Is there something you want to reflect at? I'll take Raul first and then Delaware.
Okay, well, this is always a problem. I think that we have access to the engineers are expert in different areas, always. But again, the political problem is a fight, always. Because these political issues put goals very maybe hard to match. Well, for example, the urgent. You know? Politicals say, I need a rule for tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So, well, I have access to technical expert, but I don't enough time, you know. So for this reason, it's very important to have a permanent work with, for example, IETF. Permanent work with policymakers is very important to reach the goal for us that is to deploy rules in the right way.
Yep.
You know, I want to go back to your college days. For some of us, maybe a long time ago. If you look at a business major and they wanted to woo some girl or a guy and ask them out, they would usually go buy a beer, you know, get into a flashy car and impress the girl that way. What do engineers do? They'll think the darn thing to death. That's what they will do. And that's inherent in the difference between technology developers and policy developers. A politician is not thinking in terms of what the heck does this thing do. The politician is thinking, what can I get out of it? And the technologist is thinking, how can I fine-tune this thing? And the interaction between those two, most often than not, is based upon either vendors or hired advisors. Now, every country is different. You know, there are universities that provide the same service. There are, US is very different from, say, Australia is very different from, say, Nauru. You know, very different propositions. But the principle behind that thing is that we inherently segregate our interactions. We do what we do. But the internet is not for what we do. The internet is really for what everybody wants to do. So in that case, if there's, even in forums like this, if there's formal interaction between technology developers and policy developers, then it'll trickle down that combination to the politicians, to the regulators, to the people who actually control the end product. More of that develops at a local level, better our end product will be. Because you can develop the best technology in the world. Will it get used? Absolutely not if the end users don't want it, and absolutely not if somebody isn't paying for it, and absolutely not if the governments or the controlling entities don't want it. So I think it's a progressive environment that needs to be built, that needs to take the technology to the politicians and regulators for the benefit of the end user, and vice versa. Hear out what the policymakers and the politicians and the commercial sector wants, and address that within your development.
This comes back to something that I think I heard Tim say in the context of cybersecurity solutions. How do you get them self-initiated? Is that a link that I hear correctly? And if so, do you want to speak to that, Tim?
So I hope I'm not going to just repeat what I said earlier, but the technologies that we developed within the IETF and have put into play have proved amazingly resilient when you consider the starting point for these technologies. I mean, things like the Netflix of today would have crushed the internet of 3 years ago. But these things organically have been adapted to, whether it was Napster or other file sharing. Things have changed over the years greatly in terms of what the internet has had demanded of it. And that has actually been something, that's one of the great successes. And much of that has happened simply by the fact that users wanted it and the policymakers permitted it, and then the people who operate and own the pieces of the internet actually went ahead and deployed it and met that need. Some of those places are like, you know, everybody wants their movie to run quickly. Some of the pieces that are more challenging are some of the other technologies like cybersecurity, where I think everyone agrees we would like a more secure internet. But actually making these things come to reality has proven pretty difficult. There are pieces out there like BCP38 that has been sitting there begging for people to implement it for a very long time. And I think we have to understand how we work together to actually engage and make some of those good outcomes happen. Because so far, I can't claim that we've succeeded.
I'm thinking about your comment that a good engineer tunes things to death. So you're turning me off now, okay.
Tuned the microphone to death.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm thinking about your comment that engineers tune things to death. And the funny thing, I think engineers fall into two broad categories. One of whom thinks that the product is not finished until all possible features have been added to it. And the other that thinks that the product's not finished until all unnecessary features have been removed. The latter category might turn around and say, so all I'm really trying to do is get a packet back and forth from here and there, and maybe I can move a file from here and there. So who needs all that security stuff anyway? And what we have to do, and I think we have to do this together, is figure out what that required subset is, what the happy medium is that actually accomplishes the goal, is scalable and survivable.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the clock. It's 35 past the hour. One of the things that we want to do is leave this room 5 minutes before the hour so that the next working group can start. We're not at the IETF here, we're just guests. We don't want to interfere with that work. So remember that when you leave the room, take your bags. We can dispose of them outside, but leave the room in a decent state. So that was the first thing that I wanted to inject before actually opening up the mics, because I think we have about 15 minutes now to have a conversation with all of you. And I see already some movement. If you would be so kind to state your name and then...
Wow. Okay, so Dejan Bogdanovic, my question would be, you are talking about QoS and improving QoS, but how can you marry QoS with net neutrality? And this is one thing which I find really interesting, how you can balance these two things as from a regulator perspective. Because we are building, all the technical tools for the QoS, but from a regulation perspective, it is really hard for you to decide how to, implement them.
So, in talking with the FCC, which is the US regulator, the advice that we have given them, that BitTag has given them, is that there's using QoS technologies in order to prevent communications, to make a company or an application disappear or something like that. And there's a possibility of using QoS technologies to improve the behavior of an application. Improving the behavior of the application is actually in all of our interest. Making antitrust kinds of things happen, that's an issue, and that actually is net neutrality, is going after the antitrust and making that not happen. And so we've encouraged them to distinguish between the two uses of the technology.
You have to use the mic.
Just as a follow-up, but outside of the US, because, as the internet influence is moving away from the US to the more global, you have to take into the account, the global state of the net, not just, the local US. Is there any, communication to do it, more international, or was it purely US local engagement?
Well, so again, BitTag, we developed the white papers for FCC. Funny thing, other people read them too.
So one of the things that I want to be careful at in the mic session is to go into the details of technologies and discuss specifics. But I do think that we just had, perhaps had, because I cannot read your mind, Raoul, but perhaps had a classic mismatch of communication. Because it could well be, and I'm just wondering, I'm speculating, that Raoul was talking about quality of service in a completely different way. Namely, what is the uptime of domestic connections? How long do I have cell connection service? What are completely different public policy needs than what we think of when we talk about quality of service, namely the amounts of bits available to a certain application. And I'm wondering if that just happened, so I'm going to ask if that is the case.
Well, I want to say, I don't know if we are talking about the same concept, well, because in Chile, net neutrality means only that you can block any application on the internet. Anyone can block any application in the internet. That is all. That's all. And quality of service is another thing. It's a measure of, we call quality of experience. and we try to measure the experience of the user in comparison with between all operators, that is all. So there are a gap between two concepts.
Montgomery NIST. So far in the panel, it seems like the concept of public policy has been used to be synonymous with regulation.
Can you come a little bit closer to the mic?
So far in the panel, it seems like public policy has been used to be synonymous with regulation. I wonder if you could comment on other forms of public policy, deployment initiatives, economic incentives, that might help us do some things, deploy technologies that maybe aren't being deployed.
I'm going to give this one to Tim Polk.
Thank you, Doug. So I of course concentrate on the cybersecurity issues, but you're absolutely right. There are a lot of other public policy pieces that have contributed to the growth of the internet in the U.S. We've had our broadband initiatives and the initiatives to put the internet in all of our schools. So those are there certainly are lots of other things that we can do. I, of course, am trying to figure out how we piggyback off of those to also improve cybersecurity at the same time. I think other kinds of public policy initiatives that I'm interested in are the ones that have to do with directing research and development funding, things that are building infrastructure like research infrastructure to support different things. Public-private collaborations are a big deal on, not as much in cybersecurity right now, although they should be, but in some of the other aspects of work that I do at OSTP, trying to make sure, once again, as I said earlier, government doesn't have all of the good ideas. How do we form partnerships between government and other parts of society, whether it's business, whether it's civil society, whether it's academia, so that we are getting the advantage of the best of those different worlds. I'm not sure if I really answered your questions, but there's lots of things that we can do outside the space of regulation, and we do a lot of them, but regulation does actually, regulation is the place where this most tightly converges, I think.
Thank you, Doug.
Good afternoon, Elliot Lear. I work for Cisco. I appreciate ISOC having held this panel. It's always great to hear from regulators and to get your perspectives, especially from places that are far out like Fiji, where you have very specific requirements. My question to you is, though, around how you express your needs. And it ties back to something that Tim just said, relating to public-private partnerships, which is, how is it that we don't know the questions that you're even asking at this point, right? We have an hour here, but how is it that you express questions to the private sector such that you are heard at this point? And presumably the private sector needs to extend both within your jurisdictions and beyond. How do you do that today?
I assume that.
Oh.
Thanks. I assume that question is directed at me.
All three of you, and I think Tim has or I know Tim's answer already, and read this as well because he works with me.
Couple of things. One, I want to go back to the public policy part just a bit. Public policy is not a standard by any stretch of imagination. The definition of public policy. What is public policy in which country has entirely different meanings, and how it is brought into being and how it is implemented and what consequences it has. It has, consequences. So combining the two questions, communication becomes a big issue. In some places, one man rules what a minister or what a secretary of, ministry says or what a commercial entity says, that pretty much becomes it because they control the resources. In other places, you have consumer councils that listen to people, that say what should and could be done. In smaller countries, especially countries where technology is not self-generated, or the implementation of technology is not self-generated, the donor partners have a lot to say. Who gives the money to do what ends up defining a fair bit of public policy and a fair bit of implementation. But can you change that? Not necessarily. You can influence it greatly. There's a difference, because changing it means that you throw out all the infrastructure, you throw out all the control mechanisms, you throw out all the power, and you say, no, this is not what we want, this is what we want. Influencing is very different. Whether talking to leaders of countries, or whether talking to ministers, or whether you're talking to private entities, the voice of the consumer, the voice of the end user can be presented in many different ways where it can become quite influential. Money always talks. No, not necessarily. Think about this thing. People say that penetration of mobile networks into countries has a direct relationship with the GDP of that country. Well, how exactly is that possible? Who is producing that GDP? You go back to education, mobile learning. Everybody carries a cell phone. But what do they get on that cell phone is a different question. Can you have e-government? Can you have e-health? Can you have educational and research networks that are slightly separated from the commercial networks, so that in the interest of the people of the nations, you are able to produce content that is delivered to them. You are able to transport that content. So it's not always money in terms of what am I buying, but it is also money in terms of who's subsidizing it. It's also money in terms of who's going to accept it. What am I using my cell phone for? So that becomes, I mean, a lot of universities in developing nations will talk about wireless networks and bringing in standardized learning to the students. Great, fine. What happens the minute they step off of the campus? They don't have wireless, they don't have any connectivity. What do they relate to? The cell phone they hold. Now, if they want to promote education or health or fight against communicable diseases or non-communicable disease or anything, diabetes, whatever, who's paying for that? So money is not always a bad thing. It is something that is just a fact of life. You have to deal with it in a different way. But going back to the question of influencing things, I think we get stuck a lot on changing. And we say, okay, if somebody does this, then basically somebody will pay for it, and that's what becomes the norm. We don't have to focus on changing as much as influencing, where you say, okay, the Consumer Council doesn't need to go to the regulators and fight over a particular data package rate or a monopoly over a certain area. Rather fight over giving free or subsidized access to the technology for a specific purpose. Example, education or health. That's influence. That changes things quite dramatically in the developing countries. Not as much in the developed countries. In the US, they could care less. What Verizon gives you, what Verizon gives you, what AT&T gives you, it has nothing to do with whether you can get your lessons at home or not. But in a developing country, it does matter whether you can get your lessons at home or not.
Thank you. Last question.
Thank you. Juan Carlos Zúñiga, Interdigital. First of all, I want to applaud everyone for this session. I think it's great. All that we've been hearing, it's very, very interesting, very educational for sure. And what seems to me is that we have an opportunity here to continue a relationship. I would love to see this not as a handshake between the two communities, but rather as the beginning of a continuous dialogue. And the fact that we have this interest seems to me that it could be the beginning of the snowball, right? We can start influencing indeed policies in certain parts of the world, and we know that governments and technical community will evolve and people will change, will move in and out, but if we could put in place a mechanism to continue this dialogue from now on and start spreading the word that this is a successful communication, I think that will be a good outcome and a good thing to move forward.
I think though, oh, you want to, yeah, go ahead, respond to that.
Yes, I just want to agree with Juan Carlos.
Yes.
In that it is important that this to be continuous, because you said, how do you ask the question to the, I'm going to be very honest. We call them 3 days before what they have to do, and we tell them, you have to do this. We need this in order to put this service in this emergency service. We need location services for the people who call 911 on their cell phone. When do you need that? Tomorrow. But we can do it. Somebody said it has to be done, so it has to be done. How you're going to do it is not my problem. I'm just thinking what I'm going to get out of that. So how much you have to spend, what you have to do is not my problem. If we have a continuous talk, maybe, and if policymakers have an idea of what can or what cannot be done, or what time it takes, or how much money it takes, it'll be easier for us to tell our bosses it's going to be difficult if we only have 24 hours to do that, or 48. So that's why I think it is important to have the conversation, the discussion, and it to be continuous.
I think those are good words to end our briefing panel with. I'd like to thank the panelists and the audience. I would personally like your feedback. If you have anything that you want to share, send it to kolkman@isoc.org. And please take your bags out of this room. Thank you. Picture time. Where's the photographer? Where's our photographer? Photographer. Can we quickly do a picture and then I'll stand in the back. That's probably, yeah, around the table. Yeah.